The following is the account of the life and godly practice of Joseph Alleine from his fellow pastor in Taunton, George Newton. Mr. Joseph Alleine came to my assistance in the year 1655, being then in the 21st year of his age, and we continued together with much mutual satisfaction. I soon observed him to be a young man of singular accomplishments, natural and acquired. His intellect solid, his memory strong, his affections lively, his learning much beyond the ordinary size, and above all his holiness eminent. His conversation exemplary. In brief, he had a good head and a better heart. He spent a considerable part of his time in private converse with God and his own soul. He delighted very much to perform his secret devotions in the view of heaven, in the open air when he could find advantage fit for his purpose. He used to keep many days alone, and then a private room would not content him, but if he could, he would withdraw himself to a solitary house that had no inhabitant in it. And in this he was gratified often by some private friends of his, to whom he did not impart his design. Perhaps it was that he might freely use his voice as his affections led him, without such prudential considerations and restraints as would have been necessary in another place, and that he might converse with God without any avocation or distraction. His conversation with others was always mingled with heavenly and holy discourses. He was ready to instruct and to exhort and to reprove, which he never failed to do, when he thought it necessary, whatever the event might be. But he performed it usually with such respect, humility, tenderness, self-condemnation, and compassion, that a reproof from him did seldom, if at all, miscarry. In the houses where he sojourned, their hands fed one, but his lips fed many. God freely poured grace into his lips, and he freely poured it out. None could live quietly in any visible and open sin under his inspection. When he came to any house to take up his abode there, he brought salvation with him. When he departed, he left salvation behind him. His manner was, when he was ready to depart and to transplant himself into some other family, as that the exigence of his condition and the time did more than once constrain him to call the people one by one into his chamber, from whence it was observed that scarce anyone returned with dry eyes. In matters of religion in the first table, his strictness was so exemplary, which was near to rigor, that I have scarce known any of his years keep pace with him. Surely he did more than others. His righteousness exceeded not the publican only, but the Pharisees too. He was much taken with Monsieur de Rente, whose life he read often, and imitated some of his severities upon better grounds. How often I have heard him to admire, among many other things, especially his self-annihilation, striving continually to be nothing that God might be all. But here he stays not. He was a second-table man, a man of morals. I never knew him spotted in the least degree with any unjust or uncharitable act, and I am sure that many failings of professors in this kind touched him to the very quick, and brought him low, drew prayers, tears, complaints, and lamentations both by word and letter from him, though yet the Lord would not permit him to behold and reap the fruit before he died. He had an eminently free and bountiful heart to his power, and I may truly say beyond his power, yea, much beyond it, he was willing of himself. It is but seldom that the best do need restraint in these matters, and yet we read of some who brought more than enough, yea, much more than enough. Exodus 36:5. So that there was a proclamation issued out to put a stop upon their bounty, and it is added presently, so the people were restrained. Men universally almost do need a spur, but he did rather need a bridle. When other men gave little out of much, he gave much out of little, and while they heaped and gathered up, he dispersed and scattered abroad. He did not hide himself from his own flesh, but was helpful to relations, as some of them have great reason to acknowledge. His charity began at home, but it did not end there, for he did good to all according to his opportunities, though especially to the household of faith. He considered the poor, he studied their condition. He devised liberal things, he was full of holy projects for the advancement of the good of others. both spiritual and temporal, which he pursued with such irresistible vigor and zeal and activity that they seldom proved abortive. He was a man of extraordinary condescension to the infirmities of weaker brethren, as they that are most holy and best acquainted with themselves are wont to be, instructing those that were contrary-minded in meekness, if God peradventure would give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, restoring those who were overtaken with a fault with the spirit of meekness, so dealing with them in such a loving, sweet, and humble way as considering himself lest he also might be tempted. In their confessed failings he was no way supercilious, captious, and censorious. He would maintain a good opinion of another upon a narrower footing than many others, who, to say no more, were nothing stricter, holier, humbler than himself would be. His charity believed all things that were to be believed, and hoped all things that were to be hoped. And when he deeply condemned the action, he would not judge of the estate. Indeed, he had more charity for others than himself, and though he were sufficiently mild in his judgment of others, he was severe enough in his judgment of himself. He was not peremptory in matters that belonged to doubtful disputations. He laid no more weight and stress on notions and opinions in religion that wholly depend upon topical arguments than belongs to them. He was not like many who are so overconfident in their determinations that they will hardly hold communion, nay, scarce so much as a pleasing conversation with any man, how gracious soever, who cannot think and say and act in everything as they do. He would allow his fellow members the latitude that the apostle does, and so would freely and familiarly converse with those who were sound in the faith, as to the fundamentals of religion, and who were strict and holy in their lives of all persuasions. His ministerial studies were more than usually easy to him, being of a quick conceit, a ready, strong, and faithful memory, a free expression, which was rather nervous and substantial than soft and delicate, and which was best of all a holy heart that boiled and bubbled up with good matter. This furnished him on all occasions not with warm affections only, but with holy notions too. For his spirit was an epistle written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. And out of this epistle he drew many excellent things. In the course of his ministry he was a good man, and in his heart a good treasure, whence he was wont continually to bring forth good things both in public and in private. He was apt to preach and pray, most ready on all occasions to lay out himself in such work, yea, spending himself in such work, when my sudden distemper seized upon me, put him at any time, as many times they did, upon very short and sudden preparations. He never refused. No, nor so much as fluctuated in the undertaking, but being called, he confidently cast himself upon the Lord, and trusted perfectly to his assistance who had never failed him, and so he readily and freely went about his work without distraction. He began upon a very considerable stock of learning, and gifts ministerial and personal, much beyond the proportion of his years, and grew exceedingly in his abilities and graces in a little time, so that his profiting appeared to all men. He waxed very rich in heavenly treasure by the blessing of God on a diligent hand, so that he was behind in no good gift. He found that precious promise sensibly made good to him that has, for the use and good employment, shall be given, and he shall have abundance. He had no talent for the napkin, but all for traffic, which he laid out so freely for his master's use, that in a little time they multiplied so fast that the nap could not hold them. I heard a worthy minister say of him once, not without much admiration, "Whence hath this man these things?" He understood whence he had them well enough, and so did I, even from above, whence every good and perfect gift proceeds. God blessed him in all spiritual blessings and heavenly things, and he returned all to heaven again. He served God with all his might and all his strength. He was abundant in the work of the Lord. He did not go, but run the way of his commandments. He made haste and lingered not. He did run and was not weary. He did walk and was not faint. He pressed hard towards the mark till he attained it. His race was short and swift, and his end glorious. He was infinitely and insatiably greedy of the conversion of souls, in which he had no small success in the time of his ministry. And to this end he poured out his very heart in prayer and preaching. He imparted not the gospel only, but his own soul. His supplications and his exhortations many times were so affectionate, so full of holy zeal, life, and vigor, that they quite overcame his hearers. He melted over them so that he thawed and mollified and sometimes dissolved the hardest hearts. But while he melted thus, he wasted and at last consumed himself. He was not satisfied to spend himself in public, but used constantly to go from house to house, and there to deal particularly where he had a free reception, both with the governors and with the children, and with the servants of the household, instructing them especially in the great fundamental necessary truths of the law and of the gospel, where he observed them to be ignorant, gentle, reproving them, where he found anything amiss among them, exhorting them to diligence both in their general and particular callings, entreating them who were defective by any means to set up the worship of God in their houses, and to make them little churches by constant reading of the Scripture, so that the word of Christ might deeply dwell among and in them richly, by careful catechizing of the children and the servants, if the governors were able, by frequent meditations, conferences, repetitions of that which they heard in public, especially by daily prayer, morning and evening, so that they might avoid that dreadful indignation which hangs over and is ready to be poured out upon the families that call not upon God. He made the best inspection that he could into the state of every particular person, and so accordingly applied himself to check, to comfort, to encourage, as he found occasion, all which he did with so much tenderness, humility, and self-denial, that they gained very much on the affections and respects of all that received him, and wrought them at least to outward conformity, so that they who were not visited in the beginning at length came forth and called upon him to come to their families and help them. Thus he did wear himself away and gave light and heat to others. He usually allowed himself too little sleep to recruit and to repair the spirits which he wasted with waking. His manner was to rise at 4 o'clock at the utmost, many times before, and add in the cold winter mornings that he might be with God betime, and so get room for other studies and employments. His extraordinary watchings, constant cares, excessive labors in the work of his ministry, public and private, were generally apprehended to be the cause of those distempers and decays, and at last of that ill health of body in which in the end he died. He was the gravest, strictest, most serious and composed young man that I ever yet had the happiness to be acquainted with. And yet he was not rigid in his principles. His moderation was known to all men that knew him. When he did catechize the greater sort in public before he was silenced, his manner was to begin with prayer for a blessing upon that exercise. And having proposed some questions out of the assembly's catechism to them, he was careful not only to make them perfect in rehearsing the answers there set down, but also to bring them to a clear understanding of the sense and meaning of the said answers, and of all the terms and phrases in which they are expressed, and to draw some practical, useful inferences from those heads of divinity contained in them. Also, when any distinction was necessary for the clearing up of the matter in hand, he would also be instructing his catechumens therein. Now this he would do by proposing several other collateral questions besides those in the catechism, which questions, together with the answers to them, himself had before drawn up and sent to them in writing. In the evening of the Lord's Day, his course was to repeat his sermon again in a public place of worship, where abundance of people constantly resorted to hear him, which when he had done, several youths were called forth, which did give him an account of the heads of all his sermon by memory. As for his method in going from house to house for the instructing of private families, it was this: he would give them notice of his coming the day before, desiring that he might have admittance to their houses, to converse with them about their soul concerns, and that they would have their whole family together against he came. When he came and the family were called together, he would be instructing the younger sort in the principles of religion, by asking several questions in the catechism, the answers to which he would be opening and explaining to them. Also he would be inquiring of them about their spiritual estate and condition, laboring to make them sensible of the evil and danger of sin, the corruption and wickedness of our natures, the misery of an unconverted state, stirring them up to look after the true remedy proposed in the gospel, to turn from all their sins to God, to close with Christ upon his own terms, to follow after holiness, to watch over their hearts and lives, to mortify their lust, to redeem their time, to prepare for eternity. These things, as he would be explaining to their understandings, that they might have clear apprehensions about them, So he would be pressing the practice of them upon their consciences with the most cogent arguments and considerations, minding them of the great privileges they enjoyed, the many gospel sermons that they heard or might hear, the many talents they were entrusted with, and a great account they had to give to the God of heaven, telling them how sad it would be with them another day if after all this they should come short of salvation. Besides, he would leave them several counsels and directions to be carefully remembered and practiced for the good of their souls. Those that were serious and religious he would labor to help forward in holiness by answering their doubts, resolving their cases, encouraging them under their difficulties. And before he did go from any family, he would deal with the heads of that family, and such others as were grown to years of discretion, singly and apart, that so he might, as much as possibly he could, come to know the condition of each particular person in his flock, and address himself in his discourse as might be suitable to every one of them. If he perceived that they did live in the neglect of family duties, he would exhort and press them to set up the worship of God in their families, as reading prayer and directing them how to set about it, and to take time for secret duties as well. Such as were masters of families he would earnestly persuade and desire, as they did tender the honor of Christ and the welfare of their children and servant souls, to let them have some time every day for such private duties, and to encourage them in the performance of them. Neither would he leave them before he had a promise of them so to do. Sometimes also he would himself go to prayer before his departure. This was his method in the general, although with such necessary variation in his particular visits, as the various state and condition of the several families required. If the family where he came were ignorant, he would insist longer in instructing and catechizing; if loose, in reproving and convincing; if godly, in encouraging and directing. He did use to spend 5 afternoons every week in such exercise, from 1 or 2 o'clock until 7 in the evening, in which space of time he would visit sometimes 3 or 4 families in an afternoon, and sometimes more, according as they were greater or less. This course he would take throughout the town, and when he had gone through, he would presently begin again, that he might visit every family as often as he could. He often blessed God for the great success that he had in these exercises, saying that God had made him an instrument of good to souls this way, as by his public preaching, if not more. When the ministers of this county of Somerset, at one of their associations which heretofore they held, were debating whether and how far it were incumbent upon them to set up private family instruction in their particular charges, Mr. Alleine was a man that they pitched upon for to draw up his reasons for that practice, together with a method for the more profitable management of it, from the life and letters of Joseph Alleine, written by his wife, Richard Baxter, and George Newton.